Welcome back. I'm here today with Andrew Berkman. Andrew is a screenwriter, writer, and an entrepreneur. Andrew, welcome to today's show. So, Andrew, you've had a remarkable career over the years, but I'd like you, for the audience, give us the background of where you've been in life and bring us current up to today.
Well, I grew up in New York, and I was interested in writing early on, one kind or another. I began writing for the school newspaper. My first paid job as a writer was writing love letters for boys in camp to the girls' camp for the candy privileges. And so from that point on, there's never been a time really when I wasn't working as a writer. Even in high school, I edited the school newspaper. I was working for a publishing house then. I was reading French novels for publication because the school had a really good French department. I'd gone to school in Paris and lived with a French family, so I was proficient enough to do it happily. And then in college, I continued writing. I chose a college, Kenyon, because of the Kenyon Review, which was based there, which was a prestigious literary quarterly that I wanted to work on. And so I had the opportunity to do that, and again, continued working in publishing while I was in college. And then when I got out, I went to graduate school in English and Comparative Literature at Columbia. I was in the doctoral program there, but it was way too specialized and narrow for me. It was so specific in terms of the fields, in terms of the professional orientation to it, that it seemed the opposite of a general interest in literature and reading and books and ideas. And I became restless very soon. So I left and went to work at Alfred Knopf, which is a publishing house in New York owned by Random House. And I began editing books there and translating them again from French, and did that for several years. But I was restless there as well. The people were very appealing to me because they were much more generalists than the people had been in graduate school, and very bright. But I was enough interested in writing that editing other people's things wasn't entirely satisfying to me. Now, while I was there, I also began doing book reviews. And I started doing it for a publication called The New Leader, which wouldn't pay you, but they'd run your things if they liked them. So I assembled a little batch of reviews there, and then sent them to somebody I knew at the New York Times, and was lucky enough then to begin working at the New York Times writing book reviews. And so again, that was satisfying to me, but I wanted to be writing on broader subjects and so on. So I left Knopf and I began working as a freelance writer, working for the New York Times and then also for Esquire magazine, writing pieces. And then a real fluke happened, which was that Andy Rooney of 60 Minutes wrote a piece for the op-ed page of the New York Times, making fun of people who were out of work. And he did it in his patented aw shucks voice, unable to understand how it could be that there were pages and pages and pages of help wanted ads in the paper and no one apparently to fill them. And his larger point was that people weren't willing to do the hard work of getting the qualifications to get these jobs. And really as a lark, I wrote something making fun of his piece and sent it to him. And he called me up and invited me in to see him and offered me a job on 60 Minutes. And he said that it turned out that he'd seen some of my pieces in Esquire and was interested in doing a couple of them as stories. He said he was working on a story at that moment that it would take him about a month to get me in on the rotation. He said, so I'll call you in a month. So I went home and he called me a couple of days later and he said, I was thinking about you. And I have a friend who's starting a morning show at ABC. And he said, the best time to get experience in television is when something's going on the air or off the air. And this one's bound to be a disaster, and you'll get both experiences almost simultaneously. He said, so why don't you go work for him for a month and then come to me? So he said, are you willing to see him? So I said, sure. He said, all right, I'll call him. So he called me back and he said, go see him immediately. Went to see this guy at ABC. And he was doing a show that was to be called Good Morning America. Everybody on the preceding show, the one that was still on the air but was going to go off the air in a week, AM America, had been fired that day. So as I came in to see him, the corridors were filled with 70 weeping people. And the interview lasted about a minute. He looked at me and he said, "Can you say no?" And I said, "Sure, I can say no." And he said, "I don't see it. You look too nice." And I said, "No, I can say no." He said, "I don't think so." And I said, "Well, I'm telling you I can." He said, "Well, go home. I'll think about it." So I went home, and as I walked in the door, the phone was ringing, literally. And I picked it up. He said, this man's name was Ferber. He said, "It's Ferber." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Can you start tomorrow?" I said, "No." He said, "Can you start the next day?" I said, "No." He said, "How about Friday?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, when can you start?" I said, "Monday." So he said, "Okay, come in on Monday." So I got hired for the show without any idea of what my job might be, and with no qualifications and no experience in television whatsoever. And I went in on that Monday, and it turned out that the show was going on the air a week later, and there were only 4 people that had been hired. There was David Hartman, there was this man, Mel Ferber, who's an old-time comedy director in Hollywood, and there was a producer, and there was me. And he looked at me and he said, "What's on the show next Monday?" And I said, "I don't know." He said, "Well, that's your job. People call you, they have terrible ideas, and you say no." He said, "Come back in an hour and tell us what's on the show." So it developed that I was the screen for people who wanted to be on the show, and the person whose job was to develop ideas and make sure that there was 2 hours of programming every day. Even there was a complete chance that determined my future, because it developed that I was handled to do all the entertainment, the books and the television, the movies and pop psychology and everything that wasn't hard news. And a woman with a news background had been hired to do the hard news. And her principal job was to do a segment called Face Off, which was an early version, really, of cable debates, in which there would be a topic and then 2 people who disagreed vehemently about it. And her job was to make up a topic each day and find 2 best people to represent the 2 sides of the arguments. Well, anyway, on the first day of the show, Face Off was the first segment. And sitting in the control room was Fred Silverman, who was the legendary head of ABC, and then the others on the staff who had mentioned. And we went to air. The person introduced the topic. First person gave his vehement argument, and the second one said, "Well, this is kind of embarrassing, but I actually agree with you." And Silverman turned around and he said, "Who put that spot together?" And she raised her hand, kind of falteringly, and he said, "You're fired." And he looked at me and he said, "What's your name?" I said, "Andrew." He said, "Well, Andrew, now you've got her job too." So for the first year of Good Morning America, I was in charge of doing all the segments on the show. And it turned out that Andy Rooney was absolutely right, that it was an ideal time to get experience, because you could do anything. There was nobody to say no at that point. They were so hungry for material and so hungry for people to execute it that you could experience anything you wanted to in production during that period of time. It was the era of the Op Sail celebration, when the tall ships were sailing into the harbor in New York. And so I was interested in sailing, and I arranged for the show to come from the deck of one of the tall ships as it was sailing into the harbor. I was interested in flying, and so I arranged for the show to come from a hot air balloon above the sheep meadow. And I got them to send me to ballooning school as well. So that I was young, I was 25, and the whole network was like a toy. There was no one to say no about anything.
I'm visiting here today with Andrew Bergman. Andrew, I need to take a quick break. We've been talking about how he was involved with the writing, screenwriting, and development of Good Morning America. We'll be right back after these messages.
I love fishing, with my family.
I think it would be easier to use a net.
It was so much fun.
The times when we are together, it makes it all the more worth it.
Having Dad teach them how to cast a fly rod, and
as long as we're doing stuff together, we're having fun.
Some people see a father and a son fishing together, while others see a succession plan.
Welcome back. I'm here today with Andrew Bergman, and we've been talking about his early days in the career with Good Morning America. I have to do a correction. It started in '75, and this is when you first started to come on, and still is running today. So the fascinating stories and the people that you met, and also it just didn't get into screenwriting, but also the development of the whole concept of the hot air balloons. So tell me, what are your most memorable segments and things that you learned along the way, as you work with the show?
Well, the first thing it acquainted me with was the role of accident. And one of the things that strikes me looking back at it was that when I started working, things happened very quickly for me. I was able to work for the New York Times when I was 23. I had that job at ABC when I was 25. That it seemed like I couldn't make a false step. Now, I was hugely lucky, but I think one of the reasons why I was very lucky was that I wasn't tremendously invested in any part of it working, that I had an experimental view of it all, that I thought of it all as an adventure, that I had no fear because if one thing didn't work, I assumed another one would, so that it protected me in a way from some of the contraction that happens with fear, some of the blockages to people's creativity and imagination. And I'll give you an example of how it protected me at ABC, for example. After I'd been there for about a year, the executive producer had made it a tremendous success. But because of behind-the-scenes thing, since he had more of a directing background, ABC wanted a proven talk show executive producer to take over the show. He had been doing the Mike Douglas show, and he brought his entire staff with him. And virtually everyone on the show got fired except for me. And the reason I didn't get fired was that his show, the Mike Douglas show, it had no news component. And because of the fluke of my getting also to do the news, of getting specifically to do that segment Face Off, he couldn't get rid of me. He couldn't afford to because he had nobody to replace me with. And I remember he was having his first big staff meeting, and we were talking about people who were going to be on the show the next day. And at the time, Arnold Schwarzenegger had just emerged with Pumping Iron, and he was going to be a guest on the show. And in this meeting, a producer said, "Who's this guy, Schwarzenegger?" And I said, that's offensive. I said, in the first place, it's a terrible thing to say, and in the second place, it's redundant, if you even knew German. And so this man, Fraser, stood up and he said, "Everybody get out of here, and I want to see you in my office." And so I went into his office, and he said, "How dare you say that in a meeting? How dare you try and show me up?" He said, "I almost fired you in there." And I said, "Why didn't you?" And he just stared at me. And I realized in that moment that this guy would never fire me because he was a bully. And his stock in trade was fear. And if you weren't afraid, you were secure. And if you were, well, then you became a victim. And it was a lesson that I saw again and again in a lot of places.
I think that's it's an interesting comment about how people react to that. I had a meeting with an individual this week, and we had this very topic. He says that when this event happened, I had fear in my life, and he says, and I had to do everything I could to get rid of that so I could move on. Andrew, I need to take a quick break.
Okay.
And we'll be right back after these messages. I'm visiting here with Andrew Bergman, screenwriter, early career with the New York Times and Good Morning America. Andrew, we'll be right back after these messages.
When I grow up, I want to work with very successful people.
I want to advise people so that they can pay less tax.
Hang out with my clients on the golf course.
Fishing.
And on their private yachts.
They will all be my friends too.
I want to work with the VCs who will fund the next Fortune 500 company.
When I grow up, I want to be just like my dad.
Money won't buy you happiness in life, but we can help take care of your financial affairs so you can focus on what's really important. Visiting here today with Andrew Bergman. Andrew has a remarkable career as a writer, a screenwriter, and an entrepreneur. And Andrew, Before the break, we were talking about this concept of fear. And I think every one of us has some aspect of their life, or at some point in time, they're going to encounter a decision. And oftentimes people are influenced, well, what if it doesn't work out? Or I'm going to work and this guy doesn't like me, it's my boss, and what if I feel that as you told the story of standing up to your boss, and your boss says, well, I could have fired you. You said, well, why didn't you? All of a sudden he realized, Andrew's not afraid of me. And because you weren't, you were able to, with confidence, do what you were hired to do. Along your career, what other things have you run across that have helped to build the character and confidence and moving forward in the face of, and I'm sure that you have other stories there.
Well, I think it's all impressionistic as you go along. One thing I've certainly learned along the way is that when you are young, you think there's a path. There's a way to get from A to B to C, and that if you just knew that path, you could do what you wanted to. And in fact, there is no path. It's especially true in something like writing or entertainment or the arts, but it's also true in anything. It used to be that someone would get a job at GM and stay at GM and expect to have a working life and have their retirement and have life go according to something they could imagine beforehand. But even in American business, it isn't that way. There isn't the longevity in the companies, there isn't the job security that people had assumed, and there isn't the loyalty to the workers that they'd once assumed. So that I think it's always been true, but in this world particularly, people have to be open to plan B, people have to be alert to possibilities, people have to be willing to go with new ideas of who they might be and how they might go about it, and that it's very hard to plan. I don't think you can proceed without a plan, but if you're rigidly adhering to that plan, then you may be missing other opportunities along the way. I'll give you one example. At a certain point, I'd left ABC to write for a while again, and then I came back, and I wrote and produced 2 shows that came on after Nightline. And I remember the last show was canceled after about a year because not enough of the ABC affiliates were carrying it, even though it had done very well in terms of reviews and so on, and had a good audience. But I had reached the point at ABC where I felt that everything I was doing was just slightly repetitive. I'd done a lot of stories, I'd done a lot of interviews, I'd done a lot of traveling, and I felt like anything that was to follow, even though it was a very interesting life, was going to be another version of that. And so I chose to leave. And I remember I had an interview with a fellow named Dave Burke, who was the head of ABC at that time. And I had to bring to him a list of all the people on the show, and there were about 70 of them, and suggestions for what jobs within ABC they might be appropriate for. So we got to the end of the list, and he said, I don't see your name on this list. And I said, well, I'm not on it. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, I don't have any aspirations at ABC. He said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I think I'm going to write a screenplay. And he said, do you know anybody in the film business? I said, no. He said, do you know what you're going to write about? I said, no. And he thought for a second. He said, well, if I were your father, I'd say that sounded a little feckless to me. He said, but good luck, and if you want to come back, give me a call. So I wrote a screenplay, and I had no idea whether it would work or not, but I had nothing to lose by trying it. And it got picked up very quickly at Columbia, and because I'd been lucky enough, because I'd been in that world, to know an agent. And I said, well, what happens now? And she said, well, now we got to find a producer. And I said, well, do you have somebody in mind? She said, I do. And she told me about him, and she said, I'm going to send him the script today. So she called me the next day and said, well, he said yes. And I said, well, what's next? And she said, well, we've got to find an actor. and the studio has a list. And at that time, the top actor on the list was Griffin Dunne, who had done a movie with Martin Scorsese called After Hours, but it hadn't been released yet, so he was considered very hot. And so she sent it to him, and within a day or two, he said yes. And then I said, well, what happens next? And she said, well, now we've got to get a director. And if one of the studio's list of directors says yes, then they'll fast track it. And I said, great. So she called me a few days later and she said, well, he said yes. At that time, it was a director named Michael Dinner, who had directed a movie called Heaven Help Us, or Offbeat, which had gotten very good reviews. And so I said, well, what happens now? And she said, well, you got to go out to California. And I said, when? And she said, tomorrow. She said, you and the producer are going to go out to California. And I thought, this is really pretty easy. And I thought of all my friends who are struggling in the film business. And I thought, I guess they're not very talented, because this is real, like shooting fish in a barrel. And so I got out to California, and the day I arrived, when I arrived, the producer called me and he said, well, I have some bad news. And I said, what? He said, well, the two heads of the studio just got fired. And the next day, Michael Dinner's next movie opened, and it was a bomb. And the third day, we were on the street again, and I thought, I get it. And I saw that so many things have to converge for a project like that to go, that you control almost none of it. That led to other jobs, and I got hired to do a script by a director named Walter Hill, who had done 48 Hours and a variety of other things. And I remember there was a moment when I had two job offers, and one was to do a script for Hill, and it was going to be Tales of the Crypt for Universal. And the other was to produce the David Letterman show. And I was torn, because I thought that they identified who I was. Was I a screenwriter? Was I a TV guy? And I thought I could only do one for some reason. I chose the script. It turned out that after a few weeks, Universal didn't control the rights to Tales of the Crypt, so I didn't have that job, and I'd already turned down the television job. And that wasn't a problem, because I got another screenwriting job. It wasn't necessarily something I regretted for the first job falling apart. But what I learned from that was that I should have taken both, that there was no reason not to. That now I think of work life as an experience akin to going to a newsstand, and a variety of magazines and a variety of different topics engage your interest and engage components of your personality. You might look at a business magazine, you might look at a sports magazine or a travel magazine or a design magazine, and they all reflect a part of who you are and those areas in which you'd like to have experiences in life. And I think of work that way now too. I don't really think of myself necessarily as a writer as opposed to other things, or as somebody involved in the internet as opposed to other things, or somebody who's interested in design and building things as opposed to other things. They all seem like components of my interests and natural outlets for my energy. And I think I've learned that operating that way is the path to having a satisfying work life, because you're simply doing in work the things that you would do otherwise and finding your satisfaction in that.
Well said. Andrew, I'd like to thank you for being on today's show. It's been a pleasure having you, and a great message about, looking fear straight in the eyes and pushing forward, and, not being afraid. And appreciate all that you shared. We'll be right back after these messages.